To a 10-year-old autistic boy like Leo, the world was a chaotic symphony of too loud noises and unpredictable cruelties. The cafeteria was the worst. 40 different conversations colliding in midair, silverware shrieking against plastic trays, the particular high-pitched laughter of boys who had identified a target and had no intention of letting it go. Leo had learned to manage the cafeteria with a pair of noise-canceling headphones his mother had saved 3 weeks of grocery money to buy him. They were blue, with foam padding, and they had been the single most important object in his life. Had been. Past tense. That morning, Trent Calloway, 12 years old, son of the third richest man in Ridgemont County, and the undisputed king of Millbrook Elementary's 6th grade, had plucked those headphones from Leo's head with 2 fingers, the way a person might pick up something unpleasant they'd found on the sidewalk. He'd held them up at arm's length so his 3 friends could admire them. Leo's baby years, he'd announced to the cafeteria at large. Leo had frozen in his chair. Without the headphones, the noise crashed over him in waves. Each wave a little higher, a little colder, a little harder to stay upright against. His hands had gone to his ears instinctively, pressing flat against his skull. This, apparently, was even funnier. He'd asked for them back. He'd used the precise, measured words his therapist had taught him. Trent, those belong to me. I would like them returned, please. Trent had smiled. That particular smile, the one that had no warmth in it at all, and had dropped the headphones onto the cafeteria floor. Then he placed his foot on top of them. The crack of plastic had been very quiet, almost gentle. Worse than loud would have been. Leo had not cried in the cafeteria. He had learned that crying in front of Trent was like pouring gasoline on a fire. He'd gathered the pieces of his headphones. The left ear cup was still attached. The right had sheared off entirely, exposing a tangle of copper wire, and put them carefully into his backpack. He'd eaten the rest of his lunch with his hands over his ears, staring at the table, counting the scratches in the laminate surface until the bell rang. After school, he did what he always did when he needed to think clearly. He walked 2 blocks north, away from the usual route home, to the long stretch of Miller Street where the old hardware stores had closed down and the storefronts sat empty behind metal grates. It was quieter here. The air smelled like motor oil and old brick dust, and there was a lot of sky visible above the low rooftops. That was where he saw the man. The man was leaning against a matte black Harley-Davidson the way mountains lean, as though the earth had arranged itself specifically to support him. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, which Leo knew because his teacher Mr. Reeves was 6 feet 2, and this man was visibly taller. He was wrapped in a leather vest over a flannel shirt with the sleeves torn off, exposing arms covered almost entirely in tattoos and 2 separate scars that ran diagonal across his left forearm. His jaw was broad, square, and bisected by a pale scar that ran from below his left ear to the corner of his mouth. He was smoking a cigarette with the focused, joyless purpose of a man who was not enjoying it, but needed something to do with his hands. 3 other men sat on motorcycles behind him. All of them wore the same leather vests with the same patch on the back, a skull with wings, and words Leo couldn't read from this distance, but that he would later learn said Hell's Angels, and below that, Ridgemont. Every other person on Miller Street had quietly altered their trajectory to avoid the group. An old woman with a grocery bag had turned and gone back the way she came. 2 teenagers on bikes had crossed to the opposite sidewalk without discussing it. A police cruiser had rolled past, slowed to a crawl for exactly 3 seconds, and then kept going. Leo did not cross the street. He stood on the sidewalk for 47 seconds. He counted, watching the man. He was assessing. This was something Leo did that other people found strange. He observed without acting, cataloging information with the same quiet, methodical patience that a field biologist might apply to an unfamiliar species. His mother said it wasn't strange at all. She said most people just weren't observant enough to notice things worth noticing. What Leo noticed was this. The man's eyes were red at the edges. Not from the cigarette smoke, from something else. And the way he held himself. Very still, very controlled. The way a person holds themselves when they are working very hard not to fall apart. Leo recognized that. He had held himself that way often. It meant the man was sad. Very sad. Not angry sad, which was dangerous. Just sad, which was just sad. He also noticed the folded piece of paper tucked into the man's breast pocket. It was a photograph. The corner was visible. Leo could see the bright colors of what looked like a birthday party. He made his decision. He reached into the small zippered pocket on the inside of his backpack. the one where he kept his most important things, protected from the chaos of schoolbooks and broken headphone pieces, and withdrew a folded piece of paper currency. A $2 bill. Leo had been collecting $2 bills since he was 7, when a gas station cashier had given him one as change, and his mother had explained that they were rare, technically still legal tinder, and that most people never saw them. He now owned 11. This one was his oldest, and had a slight wear crease down the center, and smelled faintly of the cedar drawer where he kept them. He had loved this bill for 3 years. He walked toward the man. The other bikers noticed him first. One of them, a heavy-set man with a gray beard and small, quick eyes, leaned forward on his handlebars and made a sound in the back of his throat. The big man lowered his cigarette and looked. Leo stopped 2 feet away from him. This was the distance his therapist called polite stranger distance. He held up the $2 bill. "Excuse me, sir," Leo said. His voice was quiet and did not shake, which surprised him, because the rest of him was shaking quite a lot. "My name is Leo. I'm 10 years old, and I go to Millbrook Elementary. A boy named Trent pushed me in the mud 3 times this week, and today he broke my headphones. I can't go to the principal because the principal is friends with Trent's dad. I can't go to the police because Trent hasn't technically broken any laws." He paused, then added, because honesty was important, "I looked it up." The big man said nothing. His expression had shifted from the blank, flat stare of a man lost in his own dark thoughts to something else. Not quite readable yet, but different. "I need to hire a monster," Leo continued, "to scare him so badly that he never comes near me again. You are the scariest person I have ever seen." He held the bill out another inch. "Is $2 enough?" The silence that followed lasted approximately 8 seconds. Leo counted. Then something happened to the big man's face. It was very small and very fast, and if Leo had been any less observant, he would have missed it entirely. The corner of the man's mouth, the side without the scar, moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of a smile, seen through fog from a distance. And in the man's red-rimmed eyes, something that had been closed for a long time opened, just a crack, like a window in a house that has been shuttered against winter. The big man reached out one enormous hand, a hand that had clearly been broken and reset at least once, with knuckles the size of walnuts, and took the $2 bill between 2 fingers, very carefully, the way a person accepts something fragile and precious. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Leo. "What's the kid's name again?" he said. His voice was very deep and very slow, like boulders settling. "Trent Calloway," Leo said. "He's 12. He has brown hair parted on the left side, and he wears Redfield Academy soccer cleats to school even when there's no soccer practice, which I think is because he wants people to notice them. His locker is number 114, and he eats lunch at table 7. The big man looked at him for another moment. Then he folded the $2 bill once, carefully, along its existing crease, and tucked it into his breast pocket, right next to the photograph. "What's your address, son?" he said. Leo told him. "Go home," the man said. "Go straight home. Don't take any detours." "Are we in agreement?" Leo asked, because contracts required confirmation. "Will you help me?" The man looked at him for the last time before Leo turned to leave. "Yeah," he said. "We're in agreement." Leo nodded once, turned, and walked home. He did not run. Running would have been undignified, and the transaction had been conducted with dignity. 3.5 blocks later, when he was certain he was out of sight, he allowed himself to cry, not from sadness, but from the specific, shaky relief of a person who has been very, very brave and can finally stop being brave for a few minutes. His name was Marcus Collier. Most people called him Grizzly. He sat on his motorcycle for a long time after the boy had gone, staring at the $2 bill in his hand. His son Danny had been 8 years old when he died. A driver running a red light on a Thursday afternoon. Grizzly had not cried at the funeral because he hadn't been able to find his way to tears, only to a vast, silent place inside himself where nothing grew. That had been 4 months ago. He had been living in that place ever since. He looked at the $2 bill. Then he looked at the 3 men waiting on their bikes behind him. "I need to make some calls," he said. Sarah Reeves, Leo's mother, had been awake since 4:30 that morning. This was not unusual. The night shifts at Ridgemont Memorial's emergency department had a way of inverting a person's circadian rhythm until rest became something that happened in irregular, anxious fragments between phone calls and alarms. She was 35 years old and had the kind of tired in her eyes that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from 5 consecutive years of being a single parent while working 36-hour rotations. She had already been to the school twice this semester, 3 times last semester. Each time, she had sat across from Principal Richard Higgins in his office, his walls lined with framed photos of himself shaking hands with various local dignitaries, and described what Leo had told her, and each time Higgins had listened with an expression of deep, theatrical concern that produced absolutely nothing. Today was the 3rd time this semester, and she was out of patience. Mrs. Reeves, Ms. Sarah said, quietly. She was very good at quiet. Ms. Reeves, Higgins amended, without apology. I want you to know that this school has a zero-tolerance policy for bullying. That's interesting, Sarah said, because Leo came home on Monday with a bruise on his collarbone consistent with being pushed from behind onto a hard surface. He came home Tuesday, missing his lunch. And today, she set the broken headphones on the desk between them. Still in the Ziploc bag, she'd put them in that morning, those. They were $140. I don't have $140. Higgins looked at the bag. I've spoken to Trent's parents, he said carefully. They're very active members of this community. I didn't ask about Trent's parents' community involvement. Higgins paused, recalibrating. What I mean to say is that they've assured me Trent is going through a difficult period at home. Leo is going through a difficult period at school. Leo is going through a difficult period every single day. Sarah kept her voice level with the deliberate effort of someone holding a very full cup. He can't communicate distress the way other kids can. He internalizes it. Do you understand what that means? It means that whatever he tells me is the minimum. The actual experience is worse. Higgins folded his hands on the desk. It was a gesture that telegraphed compassionate authority. Sarah had dealt with enough hospital administrators to recognize it as what it was, performance. I understand your concerns are very real, he said. But I want to suggest that in some of these situations, Leo's communication style might be contributing to don't, Sarah said. Just the one word. Very quiet. Very clear. Higgins stopped. She picked up the Ziploc bag. She stood. I'm going to document every one of these incidents and send copies to the district office, she said. And if my son comes home with one more injury, I will involve the police regardless of whether you think it rises to that level. She walked out before Higgins could say anything else. In the parking lot, she sat in her car for 4 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. Through the windshield, she could see the side entrance of the school, where students were filing out at the end of the day, and there was Trent Calloway, surrounded by his usual constellation of friends, laughing at something on someone's phone, utterly unbothered by the world. She drove home, and Leo was already there, sitting at the kitchen table, working on his homework with the methodical focus he brought to all his tasks. He looked up when she came in. I want to see Principal Higgins, she said. I know, Leo said. Did it work? She wanted to say yes. She had been trying to figure out how to say yes without lying, which was difficult, because the honest answer was the same one she'd given the last 4 times. She sat down across from him. Not yet, she said. Leo looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, and returned to his homework. Sarah noticed that he didn't look surprised. That was the part that broke her heart every time. Not the anger, not the tears, but the resignation. The quiet, terrible acceptance of a child who has already been told by the world, in many small ways, not to expect too much from it. Mom, Leo said, without looking up from his worksheet. Yeah, babe? I took care of it. She frowned. What do you mean? I hired someone, Leo said, still writing, to help with the Trent situation. Sarah opened her mouth, closed it, and took a careful breath. You hired someone, she repeated. Who did you hire? Leo looked up then. His expression was perfectly serene. A monster, he said. A good one. Sarah would spend the next 3 hours trying to get more details out of him. He was, as always, perfectly honest and completely uninformative. He described the man with the accuracy of a police sketch artist. Height, scars, tattoos, the patch on the vest, and it was the patch description, delivered with the same equanimity Leo applied to everything, that sent a cold, slow wave moving up her spine. She did not sleep well that night. The Ridgemont chapter held its informal evening gathering at a bar called the Iron Spoke, which occupied the bottom floor of a building that had once been a tire warehouse on the east side of town. The pressed tin ceiling was still there, painted over in black. The bar was long and scarred and had a particular smell compounded of decades of spilled beer, engine grease, and cigarette smoke that had soaked into the wooden floor. It was not the kind of establishment that appeared on Yelp. Grizzly walked in at 9:15 and set the $2 bill on the bar, flat, where everyone could see it. It was an unusual thing to do. People noticed. By 9:20, there were 11 men sitting around two pushed-together tables, beers untouched, listening to Grizzly talk. He was not an expressive man by nature. He spoke the way he moved, economically, without waste, with the weight of someone who understood that words used carelessly had costs. But tonight, something had changed in the way he carried himself. The flat, gray quality that had settled over him in the 4 months since Danny. The withdrawn, subterranean quality of a man moving through life from behind glass had been replaced by something sharper. Still quiet, but present. He told them about the kid. He told it plainly. A 10-year-old boy, autistic, bullied repeatedly, headphones broken, school doing nothing. And then the kid walks up to me on Miller Street. Walks right up. Doesn't flinch. Holds up $2 and says he needs to hire a monster. He said that last part without inflection. He didn't need to add anything to it. The table was quiet for a moment. Then Tank, Grizzly's oldest friend in the chapter, a 53-year-old former army mechanic with a beard that reached his collarbone, leaned forward on his massive forearms and said, simply, "What time does school start?" That was how it began. Word traveled the way word always traveled in the chapter. Fast, through text messages and phone calls. Amplified by the particular righteousness that men who have spent their lives on the wrong side of respectability feel when they are given an unambiguous opportunity to be right. The story passed from Ridgemont to the Bakersville chapter, from Bakersville to Elm Creek, from Elm Creek to the 3 chapters within a 2-hour drive that had standing mutual aid agreements with Ridgemont. By midnight, Grizzly had his answer. 300 writers. 7:30 in the morning. School gate. He sat alone at the bar after the others had cleared out, nursing his drink, and looked at the $2 bill where it sat under the bar light. The photograph of Danny was still in his breast pocket. He took it out and set it next to the bill. Danny's 7th birthday party, chocolate cake, gap-toothed grin, wearing the tiny leather vest Grizzly had made for him as a joke that became, improbably, Danny's favorite article of clothing. He sat with both of them for a while. Somewhere out there, a 10-year-old boy who should have been terrified of him had looked at him and seen, clear as a glass of water, a person who could protect someone. Not a thug, not a criminal, not the thing everyone crossed the street to avoid. A protector. Grizzly had spent 25 years building a reputation designed to make people afraid. He had built it so well that his own grief had no company. Nobody sent casseroles to a Hells Angels VP's house. Nobody called to check in. You lived hard and you died hard, and the code said you did both without complaint. But a 10-year-old autistic boy on Miller Street, holding $2 and asking for help with the specific, unashamed practicality of someone who simply had not yet learned to pretend they didn't need it. He put the photograph back in his pocket. He picked up the $2 bill. "Okay, Danny," he said quietly to no one. "Okay." He pulled out his phone and started making calls. "Brothers," he said, when each line picked up. "We've got a contract. Big one." A pause. Client's name is Leo. He's 10 years old. Payment is $2, and he's autistic, and some rich kid's been breaking his stuff. His voice went very level on the next part. "We don't let that stand." The responses, without exception, were some variation of, "Tell me where to be." It began as a vibration. That was the thing people always remembered afterward. Not the sound, not the sight, but the feeling that arrived first, traveling up through the soles of their shoes and into their bones. A low, sub-bass tremor that you felt in your molars and your sternum before you consciously understood it as sound. It was 7:42 in the morning on a Wednesday in October. The sidewalk in front of Millbrook Elementary was its usual controlled chaos of arriving cars and crossing guards and clusters of children making their way toward the entrance. The leaves had begun to turn and the air was sharp and clean in that particular October way, and it was, by any measure, an unremarkable Wednesday morning. Trent Calloway had arrived early. This was deliberate. Leo typically arrived between 7:45 and 7:50, walking from the bus stop on the corner, and Trent liked to be positioned at the school entrance to provide a welcome. His 3 friends stood with him, shoulder to shoulder, a wall of 12-year-old malice blocking the path to the door. Leo came around the corner at 7:43, backpack over both shoulders, head down, walking with the careful, deliberate step of someone navigating a minefield. He stopped when he saw Trent. He was still 40 feet away, and from that distance, across the ordinary noise of the morning, Trent watched him stop. Trent smiled. That was when the vibration began. It arrived without warning from the west end of Chandler Street. and at first nobody could identify it. The crossing guard, Mrs. Pelosi, looked up from her phone with a frown. A woman dropping off her daughter paused with the car door half open, head tilted. The vibration became a sound. The sound became a roar. And then they came around the corner of Chandler and Miller Streets, and the world tilted on its axis. They came two abreast in a column that stretched back and back and back beyond the turn, engine after engine after engine, black and chrome flashing in the October morning sun. Harley-Davidsons, Softails, Fat Boys, Road Kings, custom builds, each one sounding its particular thunder, and together they produced something that was less a noise than a physical event. The windows of the storefronts vibrated in their frames. Car alarms triggered and were immediately swallowed. The crossing guard took 2 involuntary steps backward. They came without hurry. That was the thing. There was no aggression in the approach, no urgency, just the vast, inexorable movement of 300 machines advancing at exactly 20 miles per hour, with the patient, unstoppable certainty of weather. Principal Higgins had been standing just inside the entrance doors with his coffee. He was through the doors and on the top step before he consciously decided to move, drawn by the sound the way a person is drawn to the window during thunder. He watched the column of motorcycles fill Chandler Street, then curve with liquid precision to line both sides of Miller Street, blocking the school entrance on all sides. 300 engines throttled down together, and the silence that replaced them was so abrupt, so total, that it had a physical dimension, a held breath, a cleared throat, the moment before a sentence lands. Trent Calloway had not moved. He stood where he'd been standing, but the smile was gone. Beneath the particular cruelty of a privileged 12-year-old, there was still the instinctive panic of any 12-year-old faced with something genuinely enormous. His friends had backed up 2 steps. One of them had dropped his phone and not retrieved it. Grizzly swung off his bike. He was wearing his full leather cut, the vice president patch on the front, the full chapter colors on the back. He walked to where Leo had stopped on the sidewalk, and Leo looked up at him with an expression of deep, uncomplicated relief that would stay in Grizzly's memory for the rest of his life. Like watching a window opened in a stuffy room, Grizzly crouched down to Leo's level, right there on the public sidewalk in front of 300 men and a school full of gaping children. "You ready?" he said. Leo nodded. He fell into step beside Grizzly, and together they walked toward the school entrance. The crowd of children parted. Grizzly stopped when he reached Trent. He did not touch him. He did not raise his voice. He stood at his full height, 6'4", and looked down at Trent Calloway with an expression that was not anger and not threat, but something considerably worse than both: absolute, unhurried attention. "You know this kid?" Grizzly said. Trent's mouth moved. No sound came out. "I asked you a question," Grizzly said. Same tone, same volume, quiet as a locked door. Yeah," Trent managed. "His name is Leo," Grizzly said. "You've been giving him trouble." It was not a question. Trent said nothing. Behind him, his friends had achieved the absolute stillness of small animals being observed by something large. "I'm not going to ask you to explain yourself," Grizzly said. "That's not why I'm here. I'm here to tell you something." He let the pause sit for a count of 3. "Leo is under our protection. Every person standing in this street right now, and everyone they know, that's Leo's protection. You understand what that means?" Trent nodded. His face had gone the particular grayish-white of someone who has just understood something very clearly. "Nodding isn't good enough," Grizzly said. "Yes, sir," Trent said. His voice was very small. Grizzly straightened up. He looked at the children crowded around, the teachers who had accumulated in the doorway, the parents frozen beside their cars. Then he turned and looked at Principal Higgins on the top step. Higgins had his coffee cup in one hand, tilted at an odd angle, as though he'd forgotten it was there. His color was bad. "You the principal?" Grizzly said. Higgins descended 2 steps. "I am," he said, "and I want you to know that this is school property and you have absolutely no right to." "This kid's mom came to see you," Grizzly said. "More than once. You did nothing." Higgins's mouth opened. "I'm not interested in the reasons," Grizzly said, in exactly the same tone he'd used on Trent. Quiet. Final. "I'm interested in the outcome. Leo is going to come to school every day. He's going to be safe. He's going to be treated the same as every other kid here. You're going to personally make sure of that." He glanced at the column of motorcycles lining the street. "And if he isn't, if I get one report, one phone call, one time that this kid comes home the way he's been coming home, we'll be back." He didn't say what would happen then. He didn't need to. Higgins looked at the street, at 300 men sitting on their bikes, still as a painted army, watching. He looked at Grizzly. He looked at Leo, standing slightly behind Grizzly's shoulder with his hands clasped in front of him and his chin raised with a dignity that was almost unbearable to witness. "Of course," Higgins said. His voice had lost something important. "Of course. Leo, my door is always." "Thank you," Leo said politely. Grizzly walked Leo to the entrance. He stopped at the door. He and Leo faced each other. "We square," Grizzly said. Leo considered this with great seriousness. "The contract specified scaring Trent," he said. "You have exceeded the terms of the contract." Grizzly's mouth did the thing again. The almost smile, the ghost of it. "Guess I did," he said. "I don't have more money," Leo said. "But I could draw you a picture. I'm good at drawing." "I'd like that," Grizzly said. Leo nodded once, sharp and satisfied, the way he nodded when something important had been resolved correctly, and went inside. Grizzly stood at the door for a moment after it closed. Then he turned and walked back to his bike, and behind him 300 engines ignited in sequence, not all at once, but rolling, like thunder moving across a plain from west to east. And the column began to move, and by 8:01 in the morning the street in front of Millbrook Elementary was empty and still, except for Trent Calloway, who had not moved from the spot where he'd been standing, and who stood there for another 40 seconds before Mrs. Pelosi, the crossing guard, gently suggested he go inside. The call started that afternoon. Richard Calloway, Trent's father, a man whose financial weight in Ridgemont County had insulated him from most consequences for the better part of a decade, called the police department at 2:15 p.m. to report what he characterized as gang intimidation and unlawful assembly. The police department reviewed the matter and called him back at 4:30 to report that the motorcycles had been parked legally on public streets, that no one had entered school property, that no verbal threats had been formally documented, and that without a specific violation of law, there was nothing to pursue. Calloway called his attorney. His attorney called the city council representative. The city council representative called the chief of police. The chief of police reviewed the matter personally and called Calloway back at 5:45 p.m. to report, with elaborate regret, that public streets were public and that standing near a school on a public street while riding a motorcycle was not, in fact, illegal. The matter, as a legal matter, went nowhere. Trent Calloway did not push Leo in the mud that week, or the week after. He did not speak to Leo at all. Actually, he navigated the hallways with a precision designed to maintain maximum possible distance between himself and Leo at all times, which Leo noted with scientific interest and reported to his mother as a significant behavioral improvement. But that was only the visible part. The less visible part began on Thursday of that week, when Sarah came home from a night shift at 7 a.m. to find two men she'd never seen before replacing the section of roof above the bathroom that had been leaking since August. They were large men with leather vests, and they worked with the focused, competent efficiency of people who fix things because things need fixing. When she stood in the driveway staring at them, one of them descended the ladder to explain, very politely, that Grizzly had sent them. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "No, ma'am," the man said, "but your roof's been leaking." She stood in the driveway for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you want coffee?" And the man said yes, and she went inside and made coffee. And by noon the roof was fixed, and she had learned that their names were Hector and Duke, and that Hector had 2 daughters in high school, and that Duke was currently rebuilding a 1967 Bonneville in his garage, and that both of them had been in the chapter for over 15 years. After they left, she sat on the kitchen chair and stared at her hands for a while. She was used to managing things alone. Leo's father had made his exit when Leo was 18 months old, which had turned out to be a mercy in disguise since he'd shown no particular gift for grace under pressure. Since then it had been Sarah and Leo and the careful, exhausting economy of a life where every dollar was already assigned to a purpose. She didn't know the language of people who showed up and fixed things without being asked. It made her feel unbalanced, like a table whose legs are suddenly all the same length after years of tilting. But the roof stopped leaking, and that was real. Over the next 3 weeks, the visits became part of the fabric of things. Not intrusive, nothing like that. More like a presence in the neighborhood. A bike or two parked a respectful half-block away. A nod from a leather-vested man when Sarah took out the trash. Once, when she came home late from a double shift, she found a bag of groceries on the porch step. Nothing extravagant, just milk and bread and a pint of ice cream, with a note that said you were out. No signature. The school was, it turned out, capable of enforcement when sufficiently motivated. Trent had been quietly informed by Principal Higgins that his behavior going forward would be closely monitored. Trent's father, for all his bluster, was a businessman, and businessmen understand consequence. The bullying stopped not just for Leo but, as a secondary effect, for 3 other students whom Trent had been targeting with varying degrees of cruelty. Mrs. Nguyen, Leo's homeroom teacher, mentioned at the parent-teacher conference that Leo had been more engaged, more talkative, and that he'd started eating lunch at a table with 2 other students instead of alone. Grizzly came by twice that first month. Not to visit the house. He stood on the sidewalk both times, out of deference to Sarah, who had not yet decided what she thought of any of this. But Leo would go out and sit on the porch steps, and the 2 of them would talk. Leo would ask questions with his characteristic unself-conscious directness about the Harley, about the patch, about the scars, about whether Grizzly had always been that tall. And Grizzly would answer, fully and honestly, in that slow, deliberate way of his. On the second visit, Leo brought out a drawing. It was done in pencil on graph paper and showed, with remarkable accuracy, a figure on a motorcycle surrounded by a carefully rendered crowd of identical figures on motorcycles, and in front of them a much smaller figure that was clearly supposed to be Leo. He had labeled each element in neat, block capital handwriting. Under the large figure on the motorcycle, he had written, Grizzly. Under himself, Elio. Under the crowd of motorcycles, the Monster Army. Grizzly looked at it for a long time. You said you were good at drawing, he said. I am good at drawing, Leo said, without any false modesty. Grizzly folded the drawing carefully and put it in his breast pocket, right next to the photograph of Danny. He rode home with it there. The trouble with living outside the law, even loosely, even in the complicated modern way that Hell's Angels chapters operated, was that enemies accumulated in the margins. The Varela organization had been operating the drug supply chain through Ridgemont County for the better part of 5 years, and for most of that time, there had been a particular equilibrium, an understanding of lanes. The Hells Angels chapter moved in spaces the Varela organization didn't care about. The Varela organization moved in spaces the chapter ignored. It was not friendship. It was not a treaty. It was simply the practical intelligence of parties who understood that conflict was expensive. But equilibrium is a condition, not a guarantee. In November, 6 weeks after the school incident, that equilibrium broke down over a question of territory that came down, as these things often do, to money. The specific details would later be outlined in a 40-page police report, but the practical consequence was this. On a Thursday night, a Varela lieutenant named Felix Garza decided that Grizzly represented both an obstacle and a message, and that removing one would send the other. Grizzly had been heading home alone from a meeting on the east side, a deliberate choice to travel solo that he would, in later months, concede had been a poor one. He was on Route 9, moving south through the section where the road runs between 2 long stretches of construction fencing, when 2 vehicles came out of the side access road on his left. He saw them late. Too late to open up on the highway, where he might have outrun them. Just early enough to pull hard right and throw the bike sideways, dropping it rather than taking the impact from the first vehicle head-on. What followed was brief, brutal, and entirely one-sided. There were 4 of them. Grizzly was one. He was found by a passing truck driver 20 minutes later, on the gravel of the road shoulder, and the truck driver called 911 with the frightened urgency of a civilian who had no idea what he was looking at except that it was bad. He was unconscious and losing blood from 2 stab wounds, one in his side, one in his left thigh, and a head laceration from the fall. The responding officers, who knew Grizzly's name and record and who arrived to find a Hells Angels VP bleeding on the shoulder of Route 9, made the assumption that most reasonable people in their position would have made, that this was the result of gang conflict, and that Grizzly was either the instigator or at minimum a willing participant. The paramedics loaded him. The officer in charge called in a detective. By the time Grizzly reached the hospital, Ridgemont Memorial, where Sarah was midway through an overnight shift, there was already talk of pending charges. The detective assigned to the case had a well-documented prior belief that the Ridgemont chapter had been moving product across county lines, and Grizzly's injuries, in his framework, were evidence of gang war rather than a targeted hit on a man who had, at his core, recently spent his evenings making sure a 10-year-old boy got to school safely. Grizzly arrived in the ER on a gurney, gray with blood loss, with an oxygen mask over his face and blood pressure taking a bad direction. The charge nurse looked at the incoming patient chart. Then she looked up and saw the leather vest, or what remained of it, cut through by scissors, and the tattoos and the patches, and behind them the man who had fixed her roof, who had talked to her son on the porch steps, who carried Danny's photograph next to his heart every day since August. Bay 2, said Sarah Reeves, and she moved. In the emergency department, there was a concept that nurses and doctors discussed in the language of dark humor but took with absolute seriousness in practice: the golden hour. The 60 minutes following a traumatic injury during which intervention was most likely to prevent the injury from becoming a fatality. Within that window, skill and speed and correct decision-making could change the difference between recovery and a very different outcome entirely. Grizzly had arrived with 31 minutes of his golden hour remaining. Sarah had been an ER nurse for 9 years. She had worked level 1 trauma centers in 2 different states. She had seen everything that a traumatic emergency department sees in 9 years, which was more than most people encounter in several lifetimes, and had left her with a particular calibration: fast, precise, unflappable, that is either a gift or a survival mechanism, depending on how you look at it. She did not let the leather vest slow her down. She did not let the detective in the corridor slow her down. She assessed, she communicated, she made calls with the authority of someone who had earned the right to make them. And when the senior attending physician arrived 4 minutes after Grizzly's gurney did, he found his most experienced trauma nurse had already established 2 large-bore IVs, ordered the right blood products, identified the more critical wound, and had the patient prepped with the efficiency of someone who had no time to waste and knew it. Stab wounds, hemothorax developing on the left, possible internal bleed from the thigh wound. She told him without preamble. BP was 80/50 on arrival. We're pushing on egg. I've got the surgeon paged. How long ago did this happen? Estimate 60 to 70 minutes from dispatch call to arrival. The attending looked at the numbers and made the same calculations Sarah had already made and moved fast. The detective, a compact man named Braxton who had a reputation for being effective but also for arriving at conclusions before the evidence did, leaned in the door of Bay 2 with his badge out. "Nurse," he said, "I need 5 minutes with your patient." "You can't have 5 minutes with my patient," Sarah said, not looking up from what she was doing. "My patient is currently occupied. This is a police matter." "This is a medical matter," she said, still not looking up. "When he's stable, you can have your 5 minutes. That conversation will take place with his attorney present and not 1 second before. Now please step back from the door." There was a pause. Braxton stepped back. The surgery took 4 hours. Sarah was not in the OR. Her role was in the trauma bay. But she stayed at the hospital past the end of her shift, which was a choice she made with the full knowledge of its personal implications and the complete absence of doubt. When the surgical resident came down to tell her that Grizzly was in recovery and stable, she sat on the bench outside Bay 2 and allowed herself the 20 seconds that her training said was sufficient for personal reaction before the professional resumed. 20 seconds. Then she stood and went back to work. Meanwhile, 14 miles away, in the small bedroom of a house on Sycamore Street, Leo Reeves had been sitting at his bedroom window since 11 p.m. This was not unusual. Leo often sat at his window at night. The dark was one of the few environments his senses found genuinely restful, quieter, and less demanding than daylight. He sat in the dark of his room and watched the street, which he found calming in the same way other children found certain television programs calming: reliable, patterned, predictable. At 11:23 p.m., something broke the pattern. A vehicle came down Sycamore Street at speed, not reckless speed, but noticeably faster than the neighborhood norm. A dark blue Dodge Ram truck, older model, and what caught Leo's attention first was the sound, because the exhaust had a particular rattle that meant one of the heat shields had come loose. He knew this because his neighbor Mr. Henderson had the same exhaust rattle and had mentioned it to his mother 3 separate times. The truck went past. Leo looked after it. He noted, the rear license plate was partially obscured by a bent bracket, but the numbers and letters were visible from his angle. He noted, there was a long horizontal scrape along the passenger side door, recent, because the metal underneath the paint was still bright silver without rust. He noted, the driver had a tattoo on his right forearm that extended below the short sleeve of his shirt, visible briefly under the streetlight. Leo did not know yet that any of this was important. He noted it the way he noted everything, because his brain did not have a filter that said this is relevant, this is not. Everything was equally worth recording. He retrieved the composition notebook from his desk drawer, the blue one, which he used for observations, and wrote it all down in his precise, small handwriting. Date, time, license plate, vehicle description, scrape, tattoo description rendered as accurately as a moving vehicle at night permitted, which was considerably more accurately than most adults could manage. Then he went to bed, because it was past his bedtime and he was a child who believed in schedules. The call from the hospital came at 6 a.m. Sarah answered it on the second ring, the way she answered all calls at unusual hours. Her voice was level before she was fully conscious, a reflex from years of on-call shifts. She listened. She said, "I understand," twice. She said, "I'll be there in 30 minutes." Leo was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his cereal bowl and his composition notebook. He looked up when she came downstairs. "Grizzly is hurt," she said. "He's going to be okay, but he was hurt last night. He's at the hospital." Leo looked at her for a moment. "Is he going to be okay?" he asked. "He's going to be okay," she said. "But there's a problem. The police think he did something he didn't do. They think he started the fight." Leo was quiet for a moment. Then he opened his composition notebook to Thursday's entry and pushed it across the table to her. Sarah looked at it. Then she looked at Leo. "That truck was on our street," Leo said. "At 11:23. I wrote it down. I think it might be the same men." He paused. "I saw a tattoo on the driver's arm. I drew it." In the margin next to the written description, in his careful pencil, Leo had drawn the tattoo. It was an eagle with a particular design on the wings, and below it, partially visible, 3 letters, VRL. Sarah stared at it. Her hands went very still on the notebook. "Leo," she said carefully, "how sure are you about the license plate?" 100%, Leo said. That was not a figure Leo used for estimation. His mother knew this. When Leo said 100%, he meant that the information was stored photographically, cleanly, without error. It was one of the few unconditional advantages of the neurological architecture that also made cafeteria noise unbearable and unpredictable social situations exhausting. She photographed every page of the notebook entry on her phone. Then she took Leo's hand, and they drove to Ridgemont Memorial together. Detective Braxton was at the hospital when they arrived. He was in the corridor outside the recovery ward, where Grizzly was being kept under a loose form of observation while the department decided what charges, if any, to file. Grizzly's chapter had sent 2 men to sit outside his room, correctly, as it happened, because they were also his informal legal notification system, and Grizzly's attorney was already en route. Braxton did not look pleased when Sarah arrived. He looked even less pleased when she held up her phone and said, "I have evidence you need to see." Leo stood beside her. He was wearing his school backpack, and he had his composition notebook under his arm. He looked at Braxton with the unabashed directness that was characteristic of him. No anxiety, no performance, and said, "I saw the truck. I wrote it down." Braxton looked at the boy, then at the notebook, then at Sarah. "He has. My son has a photographic memory," Sarah said. "He can reproduce what he's seen with complete accuracy. The vehicle that was on Route 9 last night. He saw it on our street at 11:23 p.m. He has the plate number, vehicle description, and a rendering of a tattoo on the driver's arm." Braxton's expression shifted through several phases. "Ma'am, the tattoo has 3 visible letters," Leo said. "VRL. I believe it's an abbreviation. I drew it. I can tell you exactly what it looked like." He opened his notebook to the page and held it up. Braxton looked at the drawing. He looked at it for a long moment, and something in his face moved. VRL was a known marking. It was not published information, but Braxton knew it, and the fact that a 10-year-old child had rendered it from a partial visual at a distance, in the dark, and reproduced it with this level of detail. It was either the most extraordinary coincidence he'd ever encountered, or it was exactly what the boy's mother said it was. He took a photograph of the notebook page. He took a photograph of the license plate Leo had written down. He went to his car and ran the plate. It came back registered to a man named Felix Garza, whose name was familiar to Braxton from a different file entirely, a file that had nothing to do with Hell's Angels. He sat in his car for a while, rebuilding the evening from the ground up. It was not a comfortable process. Braxton was not a man who enjoyed being wrong, but he was, when it came down to it, the kind of detective who wanted to be right, which is different and considerably more useful. He called his partner. He called the vehicle's last known address. He made 3 more calls. By that afternoon, 2 Varela organization members had been picked up on traffic violations, And within 48 hours the investigation had redirected itself entirely. The charges being considered against Grizzly were replaced by witness statements, corroborating traffic camera footage from the Route 9 construction corridor, and the testimony of Leo Reeves. Admissible, the DA's office confirmed, given its specific and verifiable nature, pointing clearly in a different direction. Felix Garza was arrested 4 days later, on charges that carried significantly more weight than anything Braxton had originally been considering. Grizzly was informed of this from his hospital bed, where he had been conscious and increasingly restless for approximately 36 hours. His attorney delivered the news. Grizzly listened without visible reaction, in the controlled way he absorbed most things. Then he asked the attorney to wait outside, and he sat alone in the room for a while. On his bedside table was the photograph of Danny, and next to it, smooth flat, was the $2 bill, which Tank had brought from the Iron Spoke when word got out that Grizzly was in the hospital, because it seemed right that he should have it with him. He looked at both of them for a long time. Then he asked the nurse at the desk if there was a 10-year-old boy in the building, and was told that a boy matching that description had been in the family waiting area most of the morning, doing what appeared to be homework. "Tell him he can come in," Grizzly said. Leo appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, still with his backpack on, notebook under his arm. He looked at Grizzly in the hospital bed, the machines, the bandaging, the 4 lines, with the careful, methodical attention he gave to everything, cataloging. Then he walked across the room and sat in the chair beside the bed. "You were hurt," Leo said. "Yeah," Grizzly said. "You're going to be okay," Leo said. "My mom told me, and my mom is right about medical things." Grizzly looked at him. "I heard what you did," he said. "The notebook. The license plate." Leo shrugged with one shoulder. "I was at my window," he said. "I saw the truck. I wrote it down. I always write things down." "Why?" Leo considered this with the seriousness he brought to direct questions. "Because the things I see are exactly what they are," he said. "I don't decide what's important before I see it. I see it first and decide later. Most people do it the other way, and I think they miss things." Grizzly was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I think you're right about that." "I know I'm right," Leo said, without arrogance. "Just accuracy." Grizzly did something that people who knew him would have considered extraordinary. He laughed. It was brief, and it pulled at his stitches, and he put a hand to his side. But it happened, and it was real, and Leo looked at him with what appeared to be mild scientific interest. "Sorry," Grizzly said. "I don't mind," Leo said. "My mom says it's good when you laugh. It means the things that are hard aren't completely winning." Grizzly looked at the $2 bill on the bedside table. He picked it up. "Your contract's been fulfilled," he said. "Plus interest." "Considerably plus interest," Leo agreed. Grizzly held the bill out to him. Leo took it carefully, held it for a moment, then tucked it into the front pocket of his backpack with the particular reverence he reserved for things that were both monetarily unusual and personally significant. "The contract is complete," Leo said. "But you're still our friend. That's different from a contract. That doesn't expire." Grizzly looked at him. The almost smile was there again, but this time it stayed long enough to be fully visible. "Yeah," he said. "That's different." The Varela organization did not take Felix Garza's arrest quietly. In the weeks that followed, word filtered through their network that the key witness was a child. The detail had passed through enough institutional channels to reach ears that had reasons to be unhappy about it. In the organization's operational logic, a witness was a liability, and liabilities were resolved. What the Varela organization had not factored into their calculations was that Sycamore Street had been under round-the-clock informal surveillance for the past 2 months by a rotating roster of chapter members who took the matter of Leo's protection with a personal seriousness that is the natural consequence of what Leo had asked of them and what they had agreed to provide. The first attempt was a vehicle that slowed to a stop in front of the house on a Wednesday evening and sat there for approximately 90 seconds before noticing 2 motorcycles parked across the street and 4 men on the adjacent stoop, none of whom were paying any particular visible attention to the vehicle, but all of whom had the specific quality of stillness that communicates "we have seen you, and we know exactly who you are." The vehicle drove away. The second attempt was more coordinated. It was also intercepted, in a manner that the police report, when filed 3 days later, would describe only as a disturbance involving unknown parties on the east side of town, with no connection made to Sycamore Street or its residents. It was not discussed in front of Sarah or Leo. This was deliberate. Sarah asked no questions. She was a woman who understood from years in emergency medicine, that some things were true whether or not you had the specific information, and that the ignorance, in these cases, was not passive but chosen. What she did know, her son was safe. Grizzly was discharged from the hospital on a Friday afternoon in early December, walking with a slight stiffness on his left side that the surgical team said would resolve over months and that he reported did not bother him, which was either true or the reflexive stoicism of a man who had once broken every bone in his left hand and described it at the time as inconvenient. He drove to Sycamore Street that evening. He came to the door this time, the first time he'd come to the door rather than stopping at the curb, and Sarah answered it in her off-duty clothes, a mug of tea in her hand, looking at him with the particular expression of a person who has saved someone's life and has still not entirely decided how to categorize the experience. "You look terrible," she said. "I know," he said. She stepped aside and let him in. He sat at the kitchen table, which was Leo's domain, 3 library books, a half-finished drawing, and a scatter of $2 bills arranged in a pattern that seemed deliberate, and he set a package on the table. It was wrapped in brown paper, neatly folded at the corners. Leo arrived from the living room with the instinctive navigation of someone who has heard a familiar voice and assessed it as safe. "You're out of the hospital," Leo said. "I'm out of the hospital," Grizzly confirmed. Leo came and sat across from him and looked at the package. "Is that for me?" "It's for you." Leo opened it with the careful, methodical efficiency of someone who folds the paper rather than tears it. Inside was a leather vest, child-sized, with the same quality of craftsmanship as the full adult versions. Real leather, real hardware, real stitching. On the front left breast was a patch that read Honorary Member. On the back, in the same script as the chapter name, was a single word, Scout. Leo looked at it for a long time. "This is real leather," he said. "Yes. This is the same kind as yours. Made by the same person." Leo picked it up and held it at arm's length, then turned it over and read the back. He set it down on the table and looked at Grizzly with an expression that was not exactly readable from the outside, but that held, behind its characteristic composure, something very full and very warm. "Honorary member," Leo said. "Does that mean I'm part of the chapter?" "It means your family," Grizzly said. "Which is more." Leo looked at the vest for another moment. Then he put it on over his sweater. It fit. The same craftsman who had made Danny's tiny vest 7 years ago had made this one from measurements Grizzly had quietly obtained from Sarah the week before. Leo sat back down, placed his hands flat on the table, and looked across at Grizzly with the vest on and his chin up. "I'm still going to pay you properly," Leo said. "When I grow up." "You already paid me," Grizzly said. Leo tilted his head. $2 isn't proper compensation for 300 motorcycles and personal protection and a roof repair." "No," Grizzly agreed. "But that's not what I meant." Leo looked at him. "You reminded me I could still do something useful," Grizzly said, and the words came slowly, the way things come out when they've been a long time finding their way to the surface. "After Danny, I thought I was done being useful. To anyone." He looked at the photograph he'd set on the table when he arrived. "You came up to me on Miller Street, and you treated me like I could still do something that mattered. That was worth more than you know." The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, the December light was failing early, going orange and then gray and then dark. Leo reached across the table and picked up the $2 bill. He held it for a moment, and then he reached further and placed it in front of Grizzly. "Keep it," he said. "For Danny." Grizzly looked at the bill. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he picked it up. "Thank you, Leo," he said. The following October, 1 year, almost to the day, since Leo had walked up to a terrifying man on Miller Street with $2 and a request, the chapter organized what they called the annual Coastal Run. 40-something bikes, mostly the core Ridgemont members, route 1 south from the city to a point where the road runs right along the edge of the Pacific, close enough that the spray reaches the asphalt on windy days. There was a new addition to the run this year. Grizzly's Harley, the same matte black Road King he'd been leaning against that afternoon on Miller Street, had been equipped over the preceding 2 weeks with a custom sidecar. It was black, matching the bike, with a low windshield and a padded interior and a safety harness that had been engineered by a retired aerospace mechanic who rode with the chapter, because if you're going to do something, you do it right. Leo sat in it with both hands folded in his lap, wearing his scout vest over a proper jacket, and looked out at the Pacific Ocean from the sidecar of a Hells Angels motorcycle going 55 miles an hour along the California coast, and felt, For the first time in his specific and meticulously cataloged experience of sensory input, that loud was not the same as dangerous. He had known, intellectually, that the two things were different. His therapist had told him this. His mother had told him this. His own rational mind had understood it. But knowledge and feeling are stored in different places, and the place where Leo kept fear had remained, for his entire 11 years, a place where loud and dangerous lived together, linked so tightly they were practically the same word. He learned the difference on Route 1, in the wind, with the ocean on his left and the sun on his right and 40 motorcycles roaring in formation around him like a living fortress. The noise was immense and complete, and it surrounded him on all sides with no possibility of escape. And he was completely, profoundly unafraid, because this was what the things that protected you sounded like. He knew that now, not just in the part of his mind that stored facts, but in the deeper place where things that are really true take up permanent residence. He looked up at Grizzly, who was riding with the particular ease of a man for whom a motorcycle is simply an extension of the act of breathing. Natural, unconsidered, continuous. Grizzly's left hand was on the handlebar, his right arm extended slightly toward the sidecar, not quite touching, but within reach. In his breast pocket, visible above the line of the leather vest, was the photograph of Danny and the edge of a folded $2 bill. Leo had asked him 2 weeks ago whether it was okay to be happy about things when you were still sad about other things. Whether those two feelings could exist in the same place at the same time. Grizzly had thought about it for a moment and then said, "Yeah, I think that's actually the only way happiness works. If everything was fine, you wouldn't need it." Leo had found this deeply satisfying. He'd written it in his composition notebook. On the cliffside stretch where the road narrows and the drop to the rocks below makes first-time passengers grip their armrests, Sarah rode in the passenger seat of Tank's pickup truck, which was following the main group at a polite distance. Because she was still, she maintained, a practical person, and she had a thorough professional understanding of what fell from heights. And she watched her son in the sidecar and felt the particular, complicated happiness of a person watching someone. They move through the world without fear. She had been afraid, for a long time, of what Leo's life would look like, whether the world would make room for him, or whether she would spend her life interposing herself between him and its sharpest edges, whether the cafeteria noise and the unpredictable cruelties and the boys like Trent Calloway, with their casual, careless power, would eventually wear him down the way they wore down so many children who didn't fit the expected shape. She had not expected the answer to come from Miller Street. She had not expected it to weigh 260 pounds and have a jaw scar and a Hell's Angels patch, or to fix her roof unbidden, or to save her son's faith in the possibility of protection with 300 motorcycles on a Wednesday morning. But the world had a way of surprising you, if you were paying attention and didn't rule things out too early based on how they looked. Tank glanced at her from the driver's seat. He was a man of few words, which she had come to appreciate in the way you appreciate furniture that has been in exactly the right place for so long you stop noticing it, and only notice when it's gone. "He looks good out there," Tank said. "He does," Sarah said. Ahead of them, on the coast road, 40 motorcycles moved through the October sunlight in a long, gleaming chain, and in the sidecar, Leo Reeves sat with his hands in his lap and his face tilted toward the sea. And he was not afraid of the noise, and he was not afraid of the world. And he was 11 years old, and he had a vest that said Scout in a family that no one had expected, and that suited him exactly. Grizzly reached over and rested one hand briefly on the top of the sidecar windshield. A small gesture, the kind that passes in half a second and says everything that doesn't need to be said out loud. Leo felt it and looked up. "Good," Grizzly said. "Good," Leo said.